Richard, thank you for coming up from Orlando. Tell me about SMA.
SMA is genetically based 100% of the time. It's actually fairly common. It's the most common fatal genetic disease of infancy, and yet most people have never heard of it. And that's because many of the babies don't live very long, and unfortunately at the most severe end it's really quite a striking disease, and similar to what we saw on the video with the gentleman who needed breathing support, nutritional support, that same level of intensity, it needs to be considered with these babies with SMA. But one of the main distinctions, even though it is a motor neuron disease, just like ALS, and it's a neurodegenerative disease where these motor neurons fail, and that's a cross-section of the spinal cord very similar to what Neil showed us just before in ALS. And on the top you can see those purple staining cells. Those are the motor neurons that should be there. And in the bottom panel you can see that same section of the spinal cord from a baby with SMA and the absence of those motor neurons. Almost an identical picture to what we saw in ALS. And yet the basic mechanism behind it and the cause and the way it evolves is really quite different, as Eric pointed out initially. So SMA is called spinal muscular atrophy because it's these nerves in the spinal cord, that's the spinal part, and when those motor neurons fail, it leads to muscle wasting or atrophy. It was first described in the 19th century, around the same time as ALS, but the genetic basis wasn't identified until 1995. So about midway through my career, I'd already been seeing babies and children with SMA for about 15 years, and then the gene was identified, and that changed everything. And I want to talk a little bit about that because that's really focused our understanding of the disease and some treatment strategies. But first I want to give you a sense of what the broad clinical range is. And we break SMA down into 4 types. And we break it down into types 1, 2, 3, 4. And type 1 is the most severe form. It presents in little babies in the first few months of life, and unfortunately they don't thrive very well. And without feeding support, breathing support, often they don't reach their first birthday. But now with better management, we've learned to be able to keep these babies going, and many of them actually get to age 10 or so, but at great expense. And the same ethical issues and technical challenges that we have with ALS, we're facing with these little babies with SMA. So that's the type 1 form of SMA. And next is what we call type 2. And that's an intermediate form. It presents later in infancy. It's somewhat less severe. These babies do get to sitting, but they don't walk. The type 1 babies, unfortunately, they don't roll, they don't sit. But the type 2 children, they get to sitting. And what's most interesting is there's typically a long plateau period. They will get to sitting, they never walk, but they stay pretty much the same. And at age 20, they're not too different than they were at age 2. Over that time course, however, they do develop increasing problems because it's a progressive disease. They're having problems with their breathing. They may need some breathing support. They have trouble with their feeding, and they need nutritional support with feeding tubes. They may get curvature of the spine and need orthopedic surgery to correct that. So these children are living longer. They're adults, often living into their 20s or 30s, but with limited function. Next is called the type 3, and that's where Griffen comes in, and I'm going to let him talk about that in a minute. But the type 3 children are perfectly normal early in childhood. You wouldn't pick them out as having any problems at all. But over the course of the typically first few years of childhood, they start to notice some weakness, and there may be some tremor. And different from the little twitches, what we call the fasciculation in ALS, often we'll see a fine little tremor in the hands, and that may be the first clue of the SMA, particularly in the type 3 child. Fortunately, type 3 and the adult type 4 form, which is pretty rare, we don't see the breathing problems. They will grow up to be healthy adults. They have normal lifespan. So one of the differences between ALS, which is more of a linear decline, and when we see SMA, there's this plateau period that is really quite striking, and it comes in these different flavors of severity, type 1, 2, 3, 4. Another notable difference is it doesn't have the upper motor neuron issues like we have in ALS. So those are the main issues of SMA. I wanted to just bring up a couple pictures, and I'll show you now And this was a little child, little baby that I took care of some years ago. And you can see how she's lying in bed, arms and legs sort of floppy to the side. Her chest is collapsed. She's being fed through a little tube that goes down into her stomach. And unfortunately, that baby didn't live very much longer after that picture was taken. And I want you to compare it now with the next photograph, which is a child with type 2. And here's a cute little girl who's sitting, but you can see she's having to prop herself up. She's not quite sitting upright. She's needing to support herself. And this little girl never achieved walking. She's now several years older and is able to get around with the use of a little power wheelchair. She's smart as the dickens. And I think, again, it gets back to some of Peter's comments that it is a cruel disease in some ways because these children are so smart. It doesn't affect the brain, but it does sap their energy and their motor function.